Hello, I'm Dr. Rebecca Ford.
I'm Dr. Matt Hannon. Welcome to Local Zero. This is the podcast that gives you a guide to taking climate action at the local level.
And in this, our second ever podcast, we'll explore the impact of COVID on our energy use and the opportunities that COVID might present for achieving net zero in the future.
And that is not a straightforward question. As we'll hear, it's not as simple as just saying COVID is helpful in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, the question is, how many of these trends are just short-term and we might just see a rebound to business as usual tomorrow or the next day? So joining us later will be Polly Billington, who heads up the UK's only local government network focused solely on tackling climate change, delivering clean energy, delivering cleaner air.
COVID has given us a foreshadowing of what a climate crisis could be like with these kind of inequalities, these kind of economic and health impacts. We've really got to dig in and do this properly. And that means investment in our communities for jobs and for better health.
So today we're talking about COVID and net zero, but clearly it's had a lot of effects very close to home. I know my life's changed considerably since March. How about you, Matt?
It's been transformational, hasn't it? It's affected every aspect of our lives and was felt acutely from the very first day. I remember that kind of oh dear moment. I think it was the day before Johnson announced, and I was one of those terrible people online panic buying, left, right and centre, and did all the things that I was moaning about. But the question is, how long term are these changes in our behaviour as well?
I haven't been out in the car. I think I've been out once since March, and it was to go and get my office chair from the office so I could be more comfortable working from home. I don't think apart from that, I've probably left the sort of 5 kilometre perimeter around my household. It's significantly impacted on my own travel. But I'm also one of the luckier few because we've got a garden. My kids have been able to play in the garden. We've got enough space in the house that we can work. Clearly, it's affected people around the country very differently.
So as always, we've got Fraser Stewart with us here, podcast extraordinaire, our production meister. Fraser, how are you?
I'm good. I think I can echo what you guys have said as well. It does feel like the world's gotten smaller. I feel very fortunate to have had a bike for the majority of this summer. So I was able to get out and see places like around Glasgow and just south of Glasgow that I maybe wouldn't have seen before. But on the other side of that, yeah, for sure, it's been peaks and troughs, shall we say. Peaks and troughs.
For me, it's shone a light on what I prioritise. Would I like to go on holiday somewhere warm? Of course I would. But, I guess you put everything under the microscope and you think, can I live with that? Is that a risk I'm willing to take? For me, what I wonder is, will I just rebound to where I was back in late February?
But it's not just us. So I was reading a report, Matt, last week that was released by the Centre for Climate and Social Transformations, or CAST. It's much easier to say.
Or CAST Centre if you're from the north of England.
The CAST Centre, yeah. And they've done a couple of surveys with just under 2,000 people across the UK, looking at how this has changed for people around the country. And certainly for a whole load of people, they've seen self-reported reductions in waste, reductions in travel, like we've just been talking about. Also reductions in consumption. People aren't going shopping anymore. Instead, they're focusing their attentions on outdoor exercise or gardening. I know that my garden has never looked better. So that's quite nice to hear. But they did acknowledge that there's a huge diversity of experience, which, as you can expect, if you've got access to the outdoors, access to a garden, access to areas, then you're going to have a very different experience than if you're living in a high-rise tower block in the inner city.
And you hit the nail on the head there, because I think what COVID has done is really shone a light on levels of deprivation. So, we've heard this rumbling on around things like school meals and what have you. But your point about the haves and the have-nots, and I think this links back to what we will discuss in future episodes around a just transition, making sure that move to a different type of economy, a net zero economy, doesn't leave any one section behind. And I think what we've seen in this kind of public health transition forced by this pandemic is those with the least are the ones that have been most left behind. And for me, that's raised a lot of questions about what we do with the climate change and a transition around that.
Yeah, and how different parts of society can come together to address that in this transition. I think that's an absolutely critical point that we need to look at more. And certainly, as you said, looking at how we can think about the changes that COVID's introduced and look to whether we can harness the good that we've seen come out of this, mitigate against any of the negative aspects, but take that forward. So how can we learn from what we've all been experiencing over the last 6+ months and grow that forwards?
Yeah, and I'm hoping all of this will become part of a post-COVID recovery, building back better. And that building back better, not just with your treasury cap on and thinking of jobs and economic stimulus, and that's all very important, but thinking about lifestyle changes and building back better that way, leading into a society where there are greater levels of well-being across the piece, whether that's built around active travel or, fairer distribution of resource. And sometimes I get out of bed and think positively, that we are going to enter a better world, because I don't think things were especially rosy before March 2020, around that.
No, I mean, I think we talk about our net zero transition and how it can drive a fairer and cleaner and greener society. We've got to recognize that there are huge problems in the energy system that we have today. It's not fair today. So how can we learn from that? How can we learn from everything that COVID has exacerbated? And please do join us in our conversation. So use the hashtag #LocalZero on Twitter and our handle at EnergyRev_UK, and send us any questions you want us to answer through this series, and we'll try and get to them as we can.
Hello, I'm Jim Watson. I'm Professor of Energy Policy at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. COVID it's had a very big impact in quite a number of different ways. I mean, the obvious one is it's changed the patterns of demand. And overall, even though demand has now rebounded, as I understand it, it's still a bit lower than it was before the pandemic hit. Clearly, our patterns of travel have changed a lot, but also things like using less energy in commercial premises, offices, and more in homes has changed. So it has changed for individual actors, particularly many householders who might end up spending more on energy, particularly through the coming winter, but also the flip side of that, particularly for people who might have lost their jobs or have lower incomes than they're expecting, a lot more people having difficulty paying their bills. And so that really brings to the fore issues of fuel poverty and what we do about that over the medium to longer term.
For me, working in a business school, one of the big kind of focus areas is, how permanent are these trends? So do you see some of this stuff slowly, shaking out and as reverting back to normal? But, similarly, are there some changes that you think are going to persist for the long term?
I mean, I think the overall aggregate impact will probably not be as big as we think in the medium to longer term. I think a lot of things will rebound at the aggregate level, but underneath that, some persistence of some of these trends, particularly working from home, people not going to offices as much. I mean, certainly for me and colleagues I speak to, we're obviously lucky we've got the kind of job where we can work from home in most circumstances. And so some of that I think will get more hardwired because it will have gone on for probably a year or more for many people. And so that has knock-on impacts for things like demand for energy for travel and things like that. But I think overall, if you look at the graphs, whether you're looking at the global picture or the UK picture, there's quite a bit of rebound now in the overall energy picture. If you look at some Asian economies, the extent of rebound is almost back to where it was.
So going beyond changes to our patterns of use and starting to think about things like efforts to increase the energy efficiency in our homes through insulation, or decarbonize our heating systems, or indeed increasing the amount of renewable electricity, have you seen COVID having an impact on these kind of broader ambitions that require perhaps planning and longer term action and thinking along the supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, probably two overall things to say. One is I don't think COVID itself and its impact really helps us in the end in the decarbonisation strategy and reaching net zero. I know it's reduced our emissions in a temporary basis, both, again, globally and in the UK, but it doesn't help in itself. Left to our own devices, and hopefully once we get to recovery, this demand will come back, the emissions will go up again. I think where there is an opportunity is clearly what the response to that is. And that's where it's really still unfolding.
I just wanted to ask the question about what COVID might mean about unleashing the realm of the possible. And what I mean by that is it's shown us how what transformative change we can make in a very short period of time. For instance, people not flying, and our skies going quiet all of a sudden. It's something we thought was just unimaginable. Do you see that as being one of the long-term effects of COVID? That actually identifying that if we see something as a crisis, in this context, a public health crisis, we can fundamentally transform how we live overnight. Is that something that can translate into the climate change debate?
I'm quite cautious about that. I'd say partly, although both are global crises that require urgent responses, they are very different in their manifestations. COVID, we can see case numbers, you can see hospitalizations, very sadly, death rates. Things happen very, very fast. Now, clearly, climate change has a lot of impacts too on people's health, on migration, and arguably on, extreme weather, which leads to people losing their livelihoods and even in some cases leaving their lives. But that connection is nowhere near as immediate. From the point of view of learning lessons, we just have to, I'm quite cautious about how far you can translate those lessons. I also think some of the things you mentioned there, such as flying, yes, I think there's a section of the population who probably have thought about it. Awareness is very high and they maybe will fly less than they would have done otherwise once that's possible. But others, for understandable good reasons, would want to still go on their annual holiday, or they've got hardwired reasons to fly. So cheap flights has meant you can go and visit relatives or places quite often, and you're asking them to suddenly stop doing that.
But stepping beyond that and talking about the energy sector a bit more, what role do you think that the energy sector can play in the wider UK's recovery?
Yeah, clearly they've got a very big role to play. And if you draw the boundary around the energy sector in quite a broad way, so it includes the trades that upgrade homes, not just those that build power stations and grids, they have a very large role to play. And there are a lot of areas that require decarbonisation where you can marry, action by them, job creation, and reducing emissions. But I think the important point is that they can only act within, the market opportunities that are there. Policy frameworks need to be there to either create or extend market opportunities, whether it be in home retrofit or clean electricity generation or smarter systems. And then obviously for anything that involves consumers, whether it be buying an electric car or upgrading their home, they've got to have somewhere an ability to pay for that, or a mechanism whereby they can borrow money or access cheap finance or have help if they're on low incomes. So I think, the ability of companies to act is very much a function of the policy environment. And so I'd always refer back to that large in-tray in number 10 Downing Street needing to be cleared a little, and some of these announcements need to be made, because that will then enable companies to act in the way that we want them to, that's aligned with net zero.
So I think on the finance thing, that's a really important one. We've got an initiative up here in Scotland, Home Energy Scotland, where you can take these interest-free loans, very long-term loans. That seems like an opportunity for some households to do something. Is this what the kind of thing you're talking about? Are you talking about more at a sort of industry scale where we're looking at Green Investment Bank 2.0, where companies can borrow tens of millions of pounds to deliver major schemes?
Yeah, I think finance is obviously an important part of the picture, and often when people are talking about the costs of net zero, they're talking in economic terms rather than financial terms. What are the conditions under which either individuals or communities or companies can borrow money and actually make investments pay? So that is very important, and having cheap finance for some individual households is really going to make a difference between them upgrading their homes or not. I think there also needs to be those regulatory backstops, you might call them, or incentives. So, we have quite a good narrative around vehicles now. 2030, the date by which you have to stop selling fossil vehicles. But we don't have an equivalent backstop around homes yet. There are some, new homes, but on existing homes and so on. And that's really required, as well as the access to the finance. And then, of course, again, for some homes and maybe some businesses, direct financial help may be needed.
Absolutely. And the focus of the pod, Local Zero, we're looking at kind of local community, grassroots, bottom-up kind of solutions to these global issues. What can we do? And if we can't do it, what can government do to help us do it?
Yeah, I think there is a hell of a lot, and some communities are doing quite a lot themselves. So the burgeoning community energy scene, which I know you, Matt, have looked at in your research as well, is an important testament to that. But in terms of its tangible impact on our emissions or on our energy, it's still relatively small. I think the local actor that has ability to